This here is a true story about crossing the pond at night in the world's smallest cockpit.
So there I was, listening to So There I Was, and I had no idea of what the heck they were talking about. So, this is Styx, and I'm here with you in the Ready Room, and I am going to help pull back the curtains on some of these amazing aviation stories that we've had. So this is the inaugural episode of The Ready Room, a YouTube companion series for So There I Was. And I am going to help bring you the backside and all of the insight or the knowledge of what the heck it is that we're talking about and why are these stories just so amazing. So I'm going to be your guide. Let's get to it. So here we are with Bonnie in episode 34, Nerves of Steel, where she is out in an A4 with a student doing an out-of-control flight demo. And we're going to join her inside the cockpit as she describes what happened with this flight.
The very first stall, we snapped over into a spiral, not a spin, a spiral. Like that. I mean, it just slapped our helmets against the canopy. We didn't have any procedures to get out of a spiral. There were no procedures. We didn't teach them. They weren't in the T2 NATOPS. And as we're spiraling down, I took the controls immediately because it wasn't a spin. And I just remember the student, we'd pre-briefed, whoever's not flying calls out the altitude, 28, 27, 26. Well, I took over immediately because this wasn't something we knew anything about and was trying different inputs. And I remember his voice starting out pretty, 25, 24, 20, and then 20, 19, 18, 17, 16. And about 10,000 feet, we're not getting any response. I have this adrenaline. Really, it's so funny because it really does make you incredibly strong, I think. But it also makes your brain work so fast. And I remember having all this time between 10,000 and 5,000 to think, dadgummit, I'm getting married in a few weeks. And when I eject, I am going to be the monster bride of bruises and dadgummit. And I remember throwing the sticks forward and doing one more rudder pump on each side. And it wobbled out at 5,000.
All right. So here we are at lesson 1. Our learning objectives. We're going to understand what is controlled flight and what are the different forces that are acting on the aircraft. We're also going to talk about what is an aerodynamic stall. And lastly, we're going to talk about this whole departing the aircraft thing. Yeah, we're going to get a little bit into the weeds here and a little bit into the details, but you know what? It's going to be worth it in the end. And I'm going to tell you one thing about learning. You got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable sometimes. So let's get to it. All right, so there are 4 forces acting on the aircraft. We've got gravity. Gravity is obviously pulling down on the aircraft, and we have lift, which is the opposite of gravity, and that is created by the airfoil, and that is what's pulling the aircraft into the air. There's drag, which is the aerodynamic force that's created by the aircraft as it tries to move through the air. There's natural resistance that occurs, and so that is drag. And then there is thrust, and thrust is created by the prop, jets, or the rotor system if you happen to be one of those rotor head types. All right, so we're going to now talk about airfoils. But in order to talk about airfoils, we got to talk about this dude over here, Bernoulli. So Bernoulli came up with this principle, and the general principle is that as a fluid moves faster, the pressure inside of that fluid decreases. So what we need to think about here is that the aircraft is actually flying through the air, with the airfoil, obviously. And I want you to think about this airfoil as being a uniform column, is flying through a uniform column of air, okay? So if you look at the airfoil, you'll notice that the upper part of the wing is curved and the lower part of the wing is more flat. This means that the lower portion of the wing has a shorter distance to travel, whereas the upper portion of the wing has a longer distance to travel. So the air traveling over, if the air is going to travel uniformly across the airfoil, the air traveling over the top has to move faster than the air traveling underneath. This in turn creates high pressure below the airfoil and low pressure above. This wants to equalize, and in turn we create this thing here called lift. And that is how an airfoil works in a nutshell. And don't look now, but you just had your first lesson in fluid dynamics. Let's talk stalls. No, not these stalls. How about these stalls? All right, so we're going to talk about stalls. So stalls occur when the angle of attack increases to a critical point where the airflow departs away from the airfoil, and that's demonstrated here. We have to understand a couple of things before we can get to that, though. So first, let's identify what's known as a chord line. So we're going to draw a straight line from the trailing edge of the airfoil to the absolute leading edge of the airfoil. Okay, that is called the chord line. And if we then draw a line that occurs, if we also draw a line to relative wind, and let's actually go ahead and we're going to add sort of an arrow this way. So there's the relative wind, and we could say it's coming this way towards the airfoil. So if we then were to measure the angular difference between here and here, we can measure what's called angle of attack. Now, as the angle of attack increases, we're going to gain more lift, and that is illustrated down here in this graph. You'll see over here, this is what we call the coefficient of lift. This is the actual ratio of lift generated by the total surface area of the airfoil. Down here is angle of attack, which is that angular difference that we just talked about. And as that angle of attack increases slowly over time, the airfoil, we start to get more and more lift up to a point where we reach what I would call diminishing point of returns. This is what we refer to as the critical angle of attack. So there's a kind of an important message here, and that is when the airfoil reaches a critical angle of attack, you're going to stall. And this is regardless of what airspeed or what altitude you might be at. We're going to talk about that next. All right, so just as I had alluded to before, we're talking about critical angle of attack. And this is actually, if we were to sort of be able to look at what the airflow around the airfoil looks like, this is what an aerodynamic stall would look like. You have all sorts of turbulent airflow up and around here. And there's a couple of different things that you have to be aware of. So we're always going to stall at one critical angle attack. This can also occur, as the aircraft slows down, it has to increase its angle of attack to generate the lift necessary to stay into the air. As the G-forces induced by the aircraft, so if we roll into a really aggressive turn, we also have to be able to now increase the angle of attack so that we can generate the lift necessary to keep us in the air. Because what happens as the G-forces increase, the forces on the aircraft increase. So like a 3G turn now is going to generate 1,500 pounds of force on a 500-pound aircraft. So something to sort of keep in mind there. Talk real briefly about critical angle of attack. We know that as airspeed decreases, the angle of attack must increase. Also, as the altitude increases, the air gets thinner, and so the aircraft either has to increase its airspeed or has to increase its angle of attack. And at some point, as an aircraft climbs up, you're going to run out of either of those. And then as the gravitational load increases on the aircraft, we must also balance that by increasing the angle of attack. So these things are constantly in balance and in flux and changing, but what's important is that the pilot must always be aware of how close they are to their critical angle of attack for their given airspeed, altitude, and whatever performance regime they're in. All right, let's talk spins. So spins require two things. Number one, we have to have a stall. So we have to reach that critical angle of attack 2, we're going to talk about yaw. So we're going to end up putting in some sort of a yaw input. Sometimes that may incur as a result of us rolling into a turn or stomping on the rudder pedal inadvertently. And this can then lead to some really bad situations. And so we need to be really cognizant and aware of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about sort of how we could end up into a stall. So we're going to take a look at a couple of different things with this particular aircraft. So here we are. The aircraft is what we call dirty. So flaps are out. I don't believe the gear is actually out on this, but that would be potentially out. And you could assume, okay, let's say we're, on a downwind approach, making a turn to come into land. And let's take a look at a couple of key things with this. So as of right now, our airspeed is pretty slow. We're sitting down at 80 knots. If you look at this little ticker tape, you can see we're in the red, so that's not good. You can see our angle of attack is pretty high, okay? Flaps are down, okay? Altitude, we're sitting up here at 10,000 feet, but the whole idea here is that this is a regime where you don't want to be in, and this is what we were potentially setting yourself up for what we refer to as the approach turn stall. So let's take a little bit of a more detailed look as to what's actually happening with the airfoils in the aircraft. So if we look at this wing here, this wing is actually advancing into the air, and this one is also retreating. Okay, this sets up sort of an interesting phenomenon because this wing is going to be generating more lift, and then this wing is going to be generating less. This sort of creates this rolling and turning moment. If you look, here's the rudder. So the rudder, there's some rudder input in there. That's sort of pulling the rudder out, or the tail of the aircraft out that way. The nose is coming out this way. And you can sort of see we're going to be setting up this natural tendency to roll and yaw, as well as getting very close to the point where the airfoil is going to stop flying. And none of that is particularly good stuff. Let's actually change the color on this real quick. And this is where, if you were to look at that stream of air coming off of here, you're going to be getting all sorts of turbulent airflow. Okay? And very quickly, this aircraft is the nose is going to snap over, and we're no longer going to be flying. So the airfoil will stop flying for us, and that is what we're trying to avoid. All right, so we're going to talk real quickly about some stall spin entry procedures. So first, we're going to be doing some clearing turns. We're going to be doing this above 10,000 feet. Actually, as we're getting ready to enter the spin, we're going to bring the power to idle. Nose is going to come up to 45 degrees. At the onset of the stall, we're going to hear a horn going off. We may notice a little bit of shuddering or buffeting in the aircraft. At that point, we're going to kick in either left or right rudder, depending upon which way we want to spin. And then we're going to continue to hold that the yoke or the cyclic full aft. All right, so we're going to talk about spin recovery procedures. A couple things are going to happen simultaneously. First is power is going to come back to idle. Rudder is going to go to the full opposite direction of rotation. So if you're spinning to the left, you're going to put in full right. Controls are going to go to neutral, meaning like right in the middle between, you're not turning left or right, and you're going to push the yoke or cyclic or stick forward. As the rotation stops, you're going to bring your rudders to neutral, or the rudder to neutral position, and then you're going to slowly ease aft stick. This is going to bring the nose back up to the horizon. We'll have air now moving back, airflow moving back over the airfoil, generating lift, and we're now back in stable flight. So we're going to jump over, do a couple of demonstrations of this so that you can see what we're talking about. What we're going to be looking at first is you'll see a typical stall spin entry and recovery. You'll see it from the cockpit, and you'll see it from an external view of the aircraft. Then we're going to do an aggravated or fully developed stall spin recovery, again from the cockpit and then from outside the aircraft.
651, did you hear my last transmission? Generic 651 ATC service is terminated.
Well, I hope you learned something, or have more insight as to why these aviation stories are just so amazing. Fig, Repeat, Bago, and I enjoy bringing you the show. The stories are just fantastic, and I'm going to be here in the ready room to answer your questions. I look forward to bringing you more content like this. Here's what you can do for us. Give us a like, comment down below, subscribe, and hit the bell. You'll get notifications when we have a live stream or a new video goes up. If nothing else, share the show. So there I was.us. Until next time, don't sit on the ejection handle, and do not let go of the collective. Check 6.